After 3 years of staying in Vienna while continuing his music studies, Beethoven finally composed works that he deemed worthy of being his first official published works. The three piano trios published in 1795, which makes up his Opus 1, followed by his second opus of three piano sonatas, published a year later when he was 25 years old. Beethoven had already published some works before these, a couple of which even had previously designated opus numbers. But to make a strong impression, he wanted his Opus 1 to be a substantial work, which would help him dominate the music scene in Vienna after Mozart's passing in 1791. These trios and piano sonatas all have 4 movements each, resembling symphonic proportions at the time, as piano trios and sonatas usually had 3 movements, and sometimes 2. In this set of videos, we will look at the first movement of the third sonata from his Opus 2 set, a sonata which I uploaded my performance of. The piece starts with a soft dynamic, which is how most of Beethoven's piano sonatas start. This motive starts on the mediant note of the key, which in addition to the soft dynamic, gives it a warm mood and helps us ease into the piece. The motive is harmonically accompanied by going from a tonic to dominant harmony. The motive is then sequenced in the following 2 measures, with the harmony going from dominant to tonic, thus resolving harmonically and giving a complete idea of this main theme. Beethoven then continues on using the same motive, but this time starting on the tonic note C, as opposed to the mediant like in the beginning, given a more direct feel. First heard in the higher register, then repeated in the bottom one. While this is going on, Beethoven emphasizes the second beat of each measure using sforzatos, giving rhythmic tension which builds up more and more energy. And with the help of the dominant to tonic relationship between the end of measure 12 and the beginning of measure 13, the built-up rhythmic tension is released in the strong orchestral tutti-like passage. This passage is comprised of a fast flurry of 16th notes, outlining the tonic C major chord, with arpeggios and broken octaves going in an upward direction, followed by a staggered descending line leading us back to a second run of that statement. The upwards direction for 2 measures, followed by going down for 2 measures, gives this sense of melodic tension and release similar to breathing in and out, adding to the expansive feel to this passage. For the second run of this passage, instead of descending with the staggered descending line in both voices, the bottom voice goes in the opposite direction in terms of every 2-note group, ending on what outlines a secondary dominant harmony from an A dominant 7th into D minor. This is immediately followed with outlining another secondary dominant harmony, this time from a D dominant 7th into G major, with new material containing a flurry of 16th notes, but this time in the bass. The energy of the bass line provides a little bit of contrast to the previous passages where the top line had the flurry of fast notes. This helps keep the interest of the listener, but not too much of a contrast that the flow is interrupted, as we are still in the first subject group of the exposition. In the foreground, we have a new statement to close this first subject group of the exposition, but the staggered descending line is like the one we saw before, but displaced by an 8th note. This gives a sense of unity for this section, as opposed to separate musical ideas forcefully glued together. Beethoven ends this section with a descending G major scale, meaning that we have now modulated to the new key of G major for the second subject group of the exposition. This is probably a good time to look at the larger form of this movement. In case you didn't know, this movement is in sonata form. I'll give a quick run-through of the standard layout of that. It is divided into 3 big sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. The exposition, which is the focus of this video, is divided into 2 sections called themes or subject groups. The first subject group is in the tonic key, which will act like a home key. The second subject group is traditionally and usually either in the dominant major key, if the tonic key was in major, or the relative major if the tonic was in minor, but it's also common for it to be in the dominant minor, if the home key is in minor. Next, we have the development section. In here, the composer will use various themes already presented in the exposition, with the key centers changing multiple times until the desired key is reached for the next section, the recapitulation. In this section, the exposition is recapped. This time, the second subject group is in the same key as the first subject group, bringing us back to the home key to end the work or movement. Back to the piece. With this in mind, the expectation is to have the second subject group in G major, but here's what we have. Beethoven starts the second subject group with G minor instead of G major. He does so with this improvisatory-like theme under a smooth broken chord accompaniment. In addition, the repeated notes at the second measure gives this section a nice rhythmic punch in an otherwise dreamy sequence. Here, Beethoven is doing a lot of tonicization, using secondary dominants, also known as applied dominants, which allows for smooth transitions along the circle of fifths without having to stay in the diatonic scale of the main key. After two measures, we get a repeat of this theme, but this time starting in D minor, with small adjustments to fit the range of the keyboard in Beethoven's day. Now, just like in the beginning of this movement, Beethoven uses emphasis on the weak beats to increase the energy using rhythmic tension. And with the help of the dominant to tonic relationship, going from an E dominant 7th harmony to A minor, the energy is released with this new energetic march-like passage. From here, Beethoven goes through a couple of modulations, first to G minor using a secondary dominant, and then to D major using an augmented 6th chord, also known as a tritone substitution. We are now in D major with this new theme, but if you remember what I said about sonata form, traditionally the second subject group would be in G major. So is this D major tonality just acting like an extended dominant harmony, going into G major? Yes, it is. After all these different harmonic progressions, we are finally at the tonality of G major. This whole idea of starting the second subject group in the parallel minor of what it will end up in is something that Beethoven was very fond of, like in the first movements of the next sonata, opus 7, the string trio opus 9 number 1, and the Pathétique sonata, just to name a few. Anyway, let's hear a bit of this theme. This lyrical theme, with long lines, provides a contrast to the more energetic themes we've heard before. In addition, the use of the non-chord tone of the sharp 4, C sharp, gives a smoother transition to this section, as we just came from a D major tonality, which has both an F sharp and a C sharp in its key. The use of this C sharp also makes it easy for Beethoven to use the secondary dominant of an A dominant 7th going into a D major chord. When we first heard this theme, it started out in the higher voice, then imitated in the lower voice, but now the order is switched. After this 4 measure repetition, with the slight variation mentioned, we get a big crescendo over 2 measures that seem to lead to something big, especially with the G dominant 7th harmony in the second measure. It's interesting to compare this to what happened previously, where after 4 measures of this dolce theme, we got a long lyrical line that lasted 4 measures, but in here we get 2 measures instead. This asymmetry gives some tension and creates a powerful transition to the next event. We're back to the high energy mood from the beginning of the movement. Beethoven is even using the same theme that we heard in measures 13 to 20, giving a sense of unity to the movement. From here, Beethoven uses this material to go through a C major harmony, D dominant 7th, then G major, forming a 4-5-1 chord progression, one of the most common progressions because of its straightforward resolution. By changing the harmony every 2 measures, Beethoven gives its resolution to the tonic a majestic feel. From there, the piece reaches an ecstatic moment, aided by the use of the sharp 4th in the top line. Beethoven then repeats this figure 3 more times, keeping the energy high for a little bit more before allowing the energy to go down in the 3 measures after that. From here, Beethoven picks up the energy for the final statement of the exposition, using a secondary dominant going into a D major chord, which is the dominant of the current tonic, G. After all this, we go back to a more sparse texture, giving us a breather from everything that happened before. During this, Beethoven goes back to emphasizing a weak beat as a way to create some rhythmical tension, while having an upward arpeggio going into the first beat, ending on 3 strong unisons, implying a 4-5-1 chord progression. Here we get a gentle dance-like figure, followed by a soft dominant chord releasing into the tonic. This is repeated, but with the dominant to tonic chord being on a higher inversion, building up a tiny bit of energy. The dance-like figure is repeated, but this time with more force and with the trill subject going on in an upward direction, outlining the dominant chord, followed by the secondary dominant, leading back to the dominant. This harmonic tension is then released with this broken octave run spanning a wide range of the keyboard.